Welcome back. In this lecture, we'll look in detail at a topic we haven't talked about much in the other lectures in this course, but it is arguably the most influential living Celtic tradition today, namely Celtic music, and, to an extent, Celtic dance. Celtic music bridges the linguistic divide between Celtic peoples and substitutes, in some cases, for languages that have gone out of use, as in Galicia and other parts of northwest Spain, and it is enormously popular around the world. Celtic music is an area where it can be very hard to be sure how much of the similarity we sometimes hear between the music of different regions of the Celtic world is due to some sort of ancient connection, and how much is due to fairly recent cross-pollination between the musical communities of these regions. Probably there is a bit of both involved. But what we can be sure of is that Celtic music has evolved tremendously over time. So I'm going to run through what we know about the musical traditions of the Celtic regions, and we'll get to hear some samples along the way. The earliest musical instrument that we know of that is associated with the peoples of Central Europe is the great Iron Age war trumpet known as the carnix. Alas, the carnix seems to have died out. We don't have physical remains of musical instruments from the Celtic regions for the early Middle Ages, but we do at least have some artistic representations. The Gauls put pictures of the U-shaped stringed instrument called the lyre on their coins. We also know something about the status of musicians in early Ireland, thanks to the Irish obsession with defining social status in a hierarchical manner. It may be no surprise to learn that musicians had a relatively high rank, and among musicians, harpers ranked the highest, just below poets and on a par with physicians and smiths and other highly skilled craftsmen. The early Irish tales also mention the magical powers of music. In the Book of Invasions, for example, the bard Avergin is able to use song to calm the waves around the island of Ireland that have been wickedly created by the Tuatha De Danann to prevent the sons of Meath from landing and claiming the island for themselves. We also know that the English invaders of both Ireland and Wales very much distrusted native musicians. The English feared that bards would pass along a lot of seditious songs and also corrupt English settlers into assimilating into native culture. In Ireland, the famous Statutes of Kilkenny in 1366 specifically barred the English settlers from employing Irish musicians because Irish minstrels coming among the English spy out the secrets, customs, and policies of the English, whereby great evils have often happened. The Act extended this prohibition to timpaners, poets, storytellers, babblers, rhymers, and harpers, and also specified that both the offending minstrel and the English patron should be thrown in jail, and that the minstrel should forfeit his instruments to the crown. Such was the attraction of Irish music, however, that the English settlers carried on employing Irish minstrels throughout the Middle Ages. Minstrels were also seen as a potentially disruptive element in Wales. In 1401, in the context of the Great Revolt of Owain Glyndwr, the English government of King Henry IV clamped down on all assemblies of Welshmen and specifically ordered that wandering Welsh minstrels, bards, rhymers, and wasters, and other vagabonds should be imprisoned. However, the early law tracts and tales don't say much about what this music was actually like. If we want to know something concrete about Celtic music, we will have to start in the 12th century, and we will need to look to the work of an outsider. Ironically, this earliest written description of Celtic music comes from one of the most anti-Celtic, or at least anti-Irish, works in history, namely The History and Topography of Ireland by Gerald of Wales. As you may recall, Gerald had almost nothing good to say about the Irish, but he did appreciate their art, and he especially liked their music. Gerald describes Irish music in this way. The movement is not, as in the British instrument to which we are accustomed, slow and easy, but rather quick and lively, while at the same time the melody is sweet and pleasant. It is remarkable how, in spite of the great speed of the fingers, the musical proportion is maintained. The melody is kept perfect and full with unimpaired art through everything, through quivering measures and the involved use of several instruments, with a rapidity that charms, a rhythmic pattern that is varied, and a concord achieved through elements discordant. Gerald then says something about the style of ornamenting the melody that resonates very well with Irish music today. Here goes. They glide so subtly from one mode to another, and the grace notes so freely sport with such abandon and bewitching charm around the steady tone of the heavier sound, that the perfection of their art seems to lie in their concealing it, as if it were the better for being hidden. What is Gerald describing in this passage? It's probably the ornamentation of a melody alongside a drone, which is the low, steady sound you get with the pipes. I'll talk more about the pipes shortly. But Gerald's praise of Irish music comes with a sting in its tail. He will allow that the Irish invented this music, but he claims that the Scots and the Welsh have now outstripped the Irish in this regard. This passage is fascinating for what it reveals about Gerald's perceptions of how the Irish are related to the other peoples of the Celtic fringe. One should note that both Scotland and Wales, the former because of her affinity and intercourse, the latter, as it were, by grafting, try to imitate Ireland in music and strive in emulation. What he means here is that Scotland is closely tied to Ireland. Scotland gets its music directly from Ireland. As we've seen, the connection between Ireland and Scotland was well known in the Middle Ages. But Gerald does not see any close connection between Ireland and Wales. There is no Celtic connection from his point of view. That may be partly because, as a part Welshman himself, he wants to draw a bright line between the Welsh and the Irish, whom he so disdains. But it's also a good reminder of the fact that in the Middle Ages, the Celtic tie between Wales and Ireland was not clear to anyone. So I said there was a sting in the tail. Gerald looks down on the Irish for using only 2 instruments, where the Scots and the Welsh use 3. The Irish use the harp and the tympanum, or hand drum, he says. The Scots use 3 instruments, the harp, the tympanum, and the crwth or crowd, which is a kind of lyre that you play with a bow. The Welsh, he says, play the harp, the pipes, and the crowd. This looks a bit odd to us, surely, since today the Scots are more associated with the pipes than the Welsh are, and the crwth is now seen as a Welsh instrument. But Gerald is not to be trusted in every detail. Gerald also wrote about Wales. He notes something very distinctive about Welsh singing that is quite striking if you're familiar with the modern Welsh choral tradition. Here is what he says. When they come together to make music, the Welsh sing their traditional songs not in unison, as is done elsewhere, but in parts, in many modes and modulations. When a choir gathers to sing, which happens often in this country, you will hear as many different parts and voices as there are performers. The tradition of vocal harmonizing, which is not characteristic of the traditions of Ireland or Scotland, was thus present in Wales from a very early date, and we'll hear an actual example later in the lecture. Gerald's observations set up some themes that are very important to this lecture. First, the character of the music of the Celtic countries. Second, the instrumentation used in Celtic music. And finally, the relationship between the music of the various countries of the Celtic world. We will touch on all these themes because, as we'll see, there is something about the character of Celtic music that seems to persist over long periods of time, even though the musical instruments used to play it, and even the languages used to sing it, have changed over time. So let's start with what this music is like, its DNA, if you will. Throughout the Celtic-speaking regions, there is a strong emphasis on the ornamentation of the melody, just as Gerald noted many centuries ago. This is what we might think of in classical music terms as the theme and variations. We can draw an analogy here to some of the literary forms I have talked about in other lectures, where the poet demonstrates his or her skill by providing seemingly endless riffs on a common theme. But if the character of this music has some elements that have remained constant, the instruments used to play it have changed substantially over time. Let's start by talking about the earliest Celtic instruments and then add them in one by one until we get to the modern day. As Gerald noted, the quintessential early instrument in all the Celtic musical traditions that we know of was the harp. Unfortunately, archaeology has been of limited use in helping us reconstruct what these early harps were like. There are several very intriguing representations of triangular harps from Scotland. We have one on a Pictish picture stone in Montefieth, dating from between 700 and 900 AD, and another from the Duplin Cross in Perthshire, dating to some point around the 9th century. Still, we can't tell as much as we would like to from these images. The earliest Irish harp to actually survive is preserved in Trinity College in Dublin. It has traditionally been called the harp of Brian Boru, the great Irish king from around the year 1000, but this is impossible, since the harp dates from the early 15th century. The tradition of the harpists was dealt a serious blow by the decline of the Irish aristocracy in the 17th century. No longer could a single noble family maintain its own retinue of poets and musicians. A few harpers hung on as itinerant musicians, traveling from country house to country house, working on commission. This last gasp of the old tradition is best exemplified by the blind harpist O'Carolan, who lived in the late 17th and early 18th centuries, and whose music is still played regularly today on a variety of instruments. Gerald also mentions the tympanum, which is some sort of hand drum. It may or may not be the direct ancestor of one of the most distinctive instruments in any of the Celtic musical traditions, the Irish bodhrán. The reason we're not sure is that the name bodhrán dates back only to the 17th century, so this instrument in its current form may have come into use only in the early modern period. The bodhrán is played either with the bare hand or with a beater called a kippeen, and that varies the sound in subtle ways. Nowadays, you can buy bodhráns that have been painted with some very Celtic-looking motifs. The next instrument in the passage by Gerald of Wales that I want to talk about is the crwth, or crowd, that kind of lyre played by a bow. It was once popular in England as well as Wales. The name of the instrument could indicate that it has a very ancient Celtic pedigree indeed. Remember that lyres were depicted on Gaulish coins. The name crwth comes from a Celtic root word that means a swelling or bulging, and that could be a reference to the more rounded shape of the medieval instrument, as opposed to the rather rectangular shape known today. In Wales, crwth players ranked just below harpers, but they too figure in the tales as having magical powers associated with their music. In one Welsh folktale, a crwth player calmed a savage pack of wolves by playing for them in a series of musical styles, first forcefully, then melodiously, then finally gently. We find a very similar story in the Irish mythological tales, where the Dagda rescues his captive harper by playing first the music of sadness, or goltree, to make the women in his audience weep. Then the music of happiness, or gantry, to cause the young people to burst into hysterics. finally, the music of meditation, or suntri, to lull his audience to sleep. The literary and musical connections among the Celtic-speaking regions are certainly close, even if we're not always sure how they were formed. The final instrument that Gerald tells us about is the pipes. The pipes are yet another example of something that came to the Celtic world from elsewhere and then developed into something distinctive. There are many different kinds of pipes, but most of them have several things in common. The first is the fact that they use enclosed reeds that are fed from a reservoir of air in a bag. The air can be provided by blowing through a blowpipe or by squeezing the bag with a bellows tucked under the upper arm, hence the name of the most common type of Irish pipes, the uilleann pipes or elbow pipes. Most pipes also have a drone, which is a pipe that produces a single constant note that underlies the melody, which is itself played on the chanter. The drone gives the bagpipes a very distinctive sound. Instruments similar to the bagpipes may have been played in various regions of Eurasia as far back as 1000 BC. But we start to know more about the pipes at the period of the Roman Empire. It's possible that the first pipes came to the island of Britain with the occupying Roman army. But there is surprisingly little solid evidence for pipes in Britain before the Middle Ages, other than what we find in texts like Gerald of Wales. The bagpipes really took off in Scotland during the 16th century, when the large pipes that we know of today as the Highland bagpipes were used as a battlefield instrument. Our old friend, the Scottish scholar George Buchanan, noted that bagpipes had replaced the trumpet on the battlefield, and they're certainly much louder. Certain Scottish Highland clans specialized in piping, and this expertise later transferred into the British imperial regiments that were staffed with Highland soldiers. Already by the 16th century, the bagpipes had spread to Ireland, and there is even a contemporary illustration of the bagpipe used in a military context in Ireland dating to 1581. This cross-fertilization between Ireland and Scotland continued, and now, of course, the bagpipes play an integral part in the traditions of American fire departments and police departments, many of which were dominated in the 19th and 20th centuries by Irish immigrants and their descendants. Aside from the characteristically Celtic instruments mentioned by Gerald of Wales, some kind of violin-like instrument was played in Ireland since at least the 8th century. The earliest surviving example dates to the 11th century. However, this medieval Irish fiddle died out. It was replaced by the European violin in the 18th century, and both Irish and Scottish music would now be hard to imagine without the fiddle. Here we see yet another example of how adaptable the Celtic traditions are to influences from outside. It would be equally hard to imagine Celtic music without the distinctive sound of the flute or the tin whistle or penny whistle. But whistles are an even more recent arrival on the Celtic music scene. They did not really start being played in Ireland until the 19th century, when they began to be mass-produced very cheaply in Manchester, England. Similarly, the accordion and concertina are also late 19th century imports into this musical tradition. And nowadays we can add the banjo, the bouzouki, and mandolin, and the guitar, among other instruments. The sound of Celtic music is always evolving. But of course I haven't yet discussed in any detail one of the most important instruments used in Celtic music, the human voice. There are several very distinctive singing styles that are vital to this tradition. Let me just run through a couple of the most prominent. The first one is an a cappella Irish style known as sean-nós. The term refers to the old style, and one of its most distinctive features is the use of the Irish language. There are many people who would maintain that if it's not in Irish, at least in part, then it's not sean-nós. This is a highly ornamented style in which the artistry of the singer is expressed through the variations on the melody, and it is usually slow and often extremely sad.
Three-legly shalomly, grousing loud, cushawn in
A very different vocal style is called lilting, which can be found in both Ireland and Scotland. Lilting is kind of like the Gaelic equivalent of scat, in which nonsense syllables are sung to a melody. Lilting could be used to accompany dancers as a substitute for a musical instrument, if none were at hand. I'll mention just one more important Irish singing tradition, namely the ballad. These story songs grew out of the bardic tradition in Irish, but in the 19th century, songs began to be composed widely in English. Many were love songs, such as the beautiful Star of the County Down.
Near to Banbridge town in the county down, one morning in July, down a bowling green came a sweet colleen, and she smiled as she passed me by. Oh, she looked so neat, from her 2 white feet to the sheen of her nut-brown hair. Sure, the coaxing elf, I'd to shake myself to make sure I was standing there.
But there is also a rich tradition of explicitly political songs in Ireland, on both the nationalist and the unionist sides. From the middle of the 20th century on, singing groups such as the Clancy Brothers and Tommy Macomb and the Dubliners made these songs popular around the world. While singing in the Gaelic world has emphasized solo performers until quite recently, the most famous form of singing from Wales is definitely choral singing. Gerald of Wales mentioned this tradition, but it was otherwise unrecorded until we begin to see notations of Welsh choral music in the 18th century, and that coincides with the Methodist revival movement. The Methodists privileged hymn singing over instrumental music because they regarded it as less decadent. And out of this tradition grew the very strong emphasis on the male voice choir. One of the other musical impacts of the Methodist revival in Wales was a decline in traditional Welsh dancing, about which we know much less than we would like. So it is far more to Ireland and Scotland that we need to look for the origins of the dance traditions that have proved so influential around the world. Unfortunately, we know even less about the origins of dancing in Ireland and Scotland than we do about music. There is less visual evidence that survives, and no artifacts, of course. There is not even a native word for dancing in the Irish language. The terms used today were borrowed from English and French. The earliest mention of dancing in Ireland is actually from a famous 14th century Middle English poem that calls on the listener to "come and dance with me in Ireland." This poem must have been referring to the tip of a fairly large iceberg, because as we have seen with music, in the 16th century, when all kinds of written sources increased tremendously, we suddenly have lots of references to dancing. Various kinds of dances are mentioned, including the hay, the fading, and the trenchmore, though alas, we have no idea what these dances looked like. Dancing was reportedly very popular among the poorer classes, especially at agricultural festivals. Irish and Scottish dance really come into focus in the 18th century, at the same time as the violin was introduced. The most important dance meters were the jig and the reel. Ironically, the jig originated in England, but it became most popular in Ireland and Scotland. The jig is a triple meter with either 2 or 3 groups of 3 notes. A jig with 3 groups of 3 notes is called a slip jig. The reel, though, did originate in Scotland, and it then made its way to Ireland, where it became enormously popular. The reel is in double or quadruple meter, and it's usually a rapid melody with an emphasis on eighth notes. There are usually two related melodic parts that are repeated in various patterns. I just want to mention one other kind of specifically Scottish dance called the strathspey. It's in 4/4 time, like a reel, but in contrast to the reel, it is slow and stately, characterized by a very distinctive rhythm called the Scotch snap, which is a short dotted note before a longer note. Nowadays, of course, Irish dancing in particular has become a worldwide phenomenon thanks to the success of the show Riverdance and its spin-off, Michael Flatley's Lord of the Dance. These dance extravaganzas draw on the tradition of Irish dance, but it's important to note that Irish dance as we know it today is a relatively recent phenomenon. The traditions I have been talking about went into decline, even in Ireland, in the 19th century, particularly under the withering criticism of the Catholic Church, until late in the century, when the Gaelic League decided to help revive Irish music and dance, just as they were attempting to revive the Irish language. The late 19th century also saw the beginning of the tradition of decorating dancers' costumes with explicitly Celtic motifs, to the point that many Irish dancers' dresses today look almost exactly like carpet pages from the Book of Kells. But just as the learned revival of the language attempted to introduce some standardization amidst linguistic diversity, the revival of dance led to a rather rigid codification of norms. Irish step dancing is characterized by the very distinctive emphasis on the rigid posture of the upper body, so that all of the focus is placed on the movement of the feet. This is not a feature of Scottish dance, which is somewhat similar otherwise to Irish dance. So presumably, at one point, the two forms were more similar. In Ireland, there was also a totally new emphasis on competition in both the solo and group forms of dance. The Irish dance world today is very heavily competition-driven. Of course, there are traditionalists and avant-gardists in any art form, and Celtic music and dance are no exception. Many groups today fuse traditional Celtic musical forms with new instrumentation. So, for example, earlier we heard the famous Irish ballad, The Star of the County Down. Here is a rather different version, played by the Celtic rock band Bryn Mawr. For some traditional music fans, this instrumentation takes some getting used to. For me, it was almost as much of a shock when the Irish folk group Clannad went electric as it was when Bob Dylan did so in 1965. But it's important to keep in mind, as I have noted, that the Celtic musical traditions have always been open to new instruments and new forms. Nowadays, Celtic rock and punk have become popular around the world. For example, we have the American bands Black 47 and the Dropkick Murphys. I want to finish this lecture by talking about two subjects that concern the way in which music connects the various parts of the Celtic world to each other. First, in something of a preview of what I will talk about in my final lecture in this course, I want to say something about the relationship between the musical traditions of the Celtic regions. And finally, I'll talk a bit about the ties between the British Isles specifically and the North American diaspora. I've mentioned in this lecture several times the ways in which the musical traditions of Ireland, Scotland, and Wales influenced each other. There is not as close a relationship between these regions and Brittany and Galicia, but if anything, the Celtic music scene in the Celtic regions of France and Spain is more explicitly pan-Celtic. For example, we have the Inter-Celtic Festival at Lorient in Brittany, which takes place the first week of August, and the Inter-Celtic Festival of Avilés in the Spanish autonomous region of Asturias, an aspirational Celtic nation that is trying to get accepted into the Celtic Club. Exactly how deep a relationship we can really trace between the music and dance traditions of these disparate regions is very hard to say, but there are certainly some similarities in melodic style and rhythms that might suggest at least a distant kinship. But this idea of being part of a wider musical community that represents an ancient kinship is a very powerful one. It is nicely encapsulated in a piece by the Irish composer Sean Davey called The Pilgrim. The piece was commissioned in 1983 for the Glasgow Royal Concert Hall to mark the transfer of the title of European Culture City from Glasgow to Dublin. The conceit is that St. Columba goes on a voyage from Ireland through all the other Celtic countries, including Galicia. It uses musicians from all the Celtic countries, so the audience actually hears the kinship between the Celtic regions. Finally, I want to say a bit about the impact of music from Scotland and Ireland in the English-speaking world, especially the United States, where immigrants from Scotland and Ulster settled in the Appalachian Mountains and strongly influenced bluegrass and country music. Also, in the Canadian Maritimes, the Scots put down roots on Cape Breton Island, and Irish immigrants actually even mingled with the French settlers in Quebec to create a distinctive musical fusion that is uniquely Québécois. The connection is not just in the sound of this music, but in the actual lyrics to the songs. The Scotch-Irish and English settlers who came to the American colonies brought their songs with them in various versions, and they have survived in Appalachia to this day. In the late 19th century, an American scholar named Francis James Child collected 305 ballads that he found on both sides of the Atlantic. These are now known as the Child Ballads, and they include some very famous songs, like Barbara Allen and the Twa Sisters. Thus, Celtic music has been international for a long time, and Celtic music and dance are now enjoyed around the world by people with 100% Celtic ancestry or none at all. Surely the ancient bards would be pleased.